The lake looked calm that morning. Nobody noticed when Sarah waded into the water, but when she didn't come back, the search turned up nothing, not a single trace. Then the divers found something else. A series of marked stones arranged in a pattern older than Tahoe itself. The sheriff called it a coincidence, but locals knew better. What they didn't tell the press was that Sarah wasn't the first. And if the legends were true, she wouldn't be the last either. I've spent months looking into this case, talking to locals who won't go near the water after dark. Some say they've seen things, shapes moving just beneath the surface. Others whisper about missing hikers, campers who never made it back to their tents. The official reports blame accidents, drownings, even wildlife. But the stories passed down for generations tell a different story. And the stones, no one can explain why they were there or who put them there. The fishermen noticed Sarah because of her clothes. She wore jeans and a lightweight jacket, not swimwear, standing ankle deep where the water met the shore. His statement to police said she faced the lake, perfectly still, as the sun dipped behind the mountains. He almost called out to her, but something about the way she stood made him pause. Other witnesses described her that evening too. A couple walking their dog saw her from about 50 yards away. They told investigators she seemed calm, too calm. Not like someone enjoying the view, more like she was waiting for something, or someone. The husband's exact words were, her arms hung loose at her sides. Not crossed, not in pockets, just there. The most unsettling account came from a teenager skipping rocks farther down the shore. He swore Sarah was speaking, though no one stood near her. When detectives pressed him, he couldn't remember the words, just that her lips moved in a steady rhythm. Then, according to him, she took 3 steps forward, deeper into the water, and stopped again, like she'd hit an invisible wall. Local rumors swirl around why anyone would enter the lake at dusk. Old-timers say that's when the water changes, not the temperature or the color, nothing measurable. But fishermen swear their lines go slack in certain spots after sunset, as if something large passes beneath them. A retired boat captain once told the newspaper, "I've seen every inch of that lake in daylight. Night's different. The lake doesn't belong to us then." Police reports show a 4-hour gap between Sarah's last confirmed sighting and when her roommate called 911. The roommate thought Sarah had gone for a walk, maybe to clear her head after an argument they'd had earlier. When Sarah didn't come back by midnight, she drove to the lake herself. She told dispatch she found Sarah's shoes perfectly placed on a rock, socks tucked inside them like they'd been arranged that way. The fisherman who saw her last insists something else was in the water with her. Not a person, not an animal, but a disturbance in the surface near where she stood. When detectives asked him to draw it, his sketch showed a dark patch that didn't reflect the fading light like the rest of the lake. He said it reminded him of oil spreading on water, except it didn't move, just stayed there, right beside her, until she stepped deeper and everything went still again. Parks Department records show that particular shoreline has no unusual drop-offs or currents. The lake bed slopes gently for about 20 feet before getting deeper. Search teams later walked that exact route in daylight, waist deep, and found nothing but smooth sand beneath their feet. But locals avoid that exact stretch after dark, not because of Sarah's disappearance. That's been going on longer than anyone can remember. One woman who's lived near the lake since the 1970s told me, "Kids used to dare each other to touch the water after sunset. Then a few came back, wrong, not hurt, not even wet most times, just different." She wouldn't explain what she meant by wrong, but her hand shook when she lit her cigarette. The official report lists Sarah's last sighting as 7:42 p.m., based on the fisherman's watch and corroborated by the couple's phone photos of the sunset. The timestamp on the teenager's video, the one where he claims to have captured Sarah speaking, shows 7:51 p.m. Detectives noted there's no audio in that clip, just 9 seconds of grainy footage where Sarah's mouth moves silently before she turns toward the lake. Some think she walked into deeper water voluntarily. Others say the way her shoes were placed suggests she meant to return. The fisherman sticks to his story, that she wasn't alone out there. He sold his boat 2 weeks later and moved to Arizona. When I tracked him down last year, all he'd say was, "I told them what I saw. Nobody wanted to hear the rest of it." The search started at dawn. Volunteers and police walked shoulder to shoulder along the shoreline, calling Sarah's name. The dogs had her scent immediately. One handler told me later it was like she'd left a trail of breadcrumbs straight from her shoes to the water's edge. Then, right where the sand turned wet, the scent vanished. Not faded, not scattered by wind, just gone, like she'd stepped off the face of the earth. Divers went in next. Lake Tahoe's water is so clear you can see down 70 feet on a good day. But that morning a haze hung near the bottom. One diver's report mentioned patches of water so cold his computer malfunctioned. Not pockets of chilly water, that's normal for deep lakes, but sudden drops of 20 degrees in less than 3 feet of space. His backup thermometer showed the same thing. He circled one spot 3 times because his oxygen gauge kept glitching when he got near it. Sonar teams found stranger things. Normal lake debris, branches, lost fishing gear, shows up as fuzzy blobs. But some returns that day came back sharp-edged, rectangular almost, clustered along an area locals call the deep shelf. When they marked those spots for divers to check, 2 buoys sank overnight without explanation. The nylon ropes weren't cut. They just went under. Things turned up in the search, just not Sarah. A pocket knife with initials not matching anyone involved in the case. A waterlogged paperback from the 1980s. Odd, because the edition only started printing in 2004. One volunteer found a hair elastic caught on a bush half a mile from shore, still damp. Sarah's roommate confirmed it looked like hers, but couldn't say for sure. Lab tests came back inconclusive. Too much exposure to the elements. Current experts from UC Davis mapped the lake's flow patterns free of charge. Their models showed nothing that could have carried a body deeper without leaving traces. Not in that time frame. Not with the wind conditions that night. Yet when they simulated Sarah's possible path based on where she entered, every projection had her remaining in the shallows. One grad student told me off record, "We ran it 8 times. Unless she grew gills and swam 70 yards straight down, she shouldn't have disappeared." Day 2 brought more searchers and less hope. Sheriff's Department logs note a curious moment when all 5 cadaver dogs sat down at once near a cluster of boulders. Not laid down to rest. Sat straight up like they'd been given a command. One handler tried pulling her dog forward by the leash. It whined and backed away, something these highly trained animals aren't supposed to do. The rocks were searched manually. Nothing was there. By afternoon, divers started reporting odd sensations. 2 described pressure changes. That made their ears pop violently, though readings showed normal depths. Another surfaced early because his regulator started delivering air in uneven bursts, mechanically impossible unless something was blocking the intake. Equipment checks later found nothing wrong. One rookie diver quit the team entirely after insisting something brushed against his leg in perfectly clear water with nothing around for 20 feet. His supervisor wrote it off as nerves. The third day brought FBI divers with side-scan sonar. They found car parts, a sunken rowboat, even an old wagon wheel from pioneer times. No Sarah. Their thermal imaging picked up scattered cold zones, matching what the first diver reported. But when they sent probes, temperatures normalized immediately upon contact. One agent's report simply states, "Equipment unreliable in subject area. Possible mineral deposits affecting readings." No mineral deposits were ever confirmed. Items kept appearing where they shouldn't. A ski glove miles from any ski resort. Sunglasses with lenses melted into odd shapes. One detective's notes mention a single rusted railroad spike lying clean on the sand, as if placed there, though no trains ever ran near that part of the lake. Everything got bagged and logged, but nothing connected to Sarah. The official search ended at sunset on day 3. Procedures state missing person operations transition to recovery after 72 hours with no sign. Sarah's parents begged for one more day, so volunteers kept looking privately. They found a single sandal, 3 coves over from where she disappeared, too small to be hers, brand new without a single scuff. Still dry, though it sat inches from the waterline. One diver stayed late after the others left. His personal journal, not the official report, describes seeing lights moving deep below where the sonar anomalies clustered. Not flashlight beams, soft glows that pulsed irregularly. He marked the spot with GPS and came back the next morning with a waterproof camera. The photos showed only dark water. When he dove back down, his coordinates led him to a featureless stretch of sand. He later told his wife, "I know what I saw. I just don't know what it means." He transferred to motorcycle patrol 2 weeks later. The sheriff held a press conference announcing the search's suspension. Microphones picked up him whispering to a deputy beforehand, "Say the currents again." They always buy the currents. Statistics confirm an average of 3 drownings per year in Lake Tahoe. All other victims surfaced within 10 days. Sarah didn't. Her case file has a single sticky note on the cover. Written by a detective who later retired early, it says, "Not the first. Check 1987, 1993. Those files are now missing." The divers almost missed the stones. They were lying in about 15 feet of water, half buried in the sand near where Sarah was last seen. At first glance, they looked like regular lake rocks, smooth from years of water washing over them. But when a deputy pulled one up to check underneath, he noticed the carving. Not scratches from boat anchors or fishing gear. Deliberate shapes cut deep into the stone. Investigators initially thought it was vandalism. Tahoe gets its share of drunk tourists leaving their mark on things. They bagged a few stones as evidence and didn't think much of it until the park ranger saw them. He'd worked the area for 20 years and immediately called his contacts at the Washoe Tribal Council. The response was unusual. 2 elders came to the station, looked at the photos, and left without saying a word. When detectives followed up, the tribal office said they had no comment at this time. It took a historian from Reno to crack part of the mystery. Dr. Carrie Mitchell specializes in pre-colonial artifacts, and her email to the sheriff's department still circulates among conspiracy forums. She wrote that the symbols weren't Washoe, not even Paiute, the 2 main tribes in the area. They predated any known local culture by centuries. The closest match she found was a fragment of pottery from a cave in New Mexico, dated to around 1100 AD. The problem? That site sits over 800 miles away. Archaeological records show Lake Tahoe's shoreline changed drastically during the last ice age. What's now underwater was once dry land, and vice versa. A 1992 survey found evidence of ancient campfires beneath 40 feet of water near Cave Rock. But those sites were thousands of years old, while the stones looked freshly placed, or more accurately, recently uncovered. One diver's notes mention how the sand around the stones appeared scooped out, like something had exposed them on purpose. Native accounts mention the lake's strange history long before settlers arrived. One Paiute legend describes water people who lived beneath the surface, surfacing only during certain moons to trade with land dwellers. Another warns of stones that sing when the water sleeps, though no one I spoke to could explain what that meant. The Washoe have a tradition of leaving offerings at certain spots along the shore, usually beads or small carvings, but refuse to discuss the practice with outsiders. The marks on the stones kept showing up in odd places. A backpacker photographed similar symbols inside a hollow tree near Fallen Leaf Lake in 2015. A snowmobiler found them carved into ice at Spooner Summit during a rare winter freeze in 2009. The common thread: all sightings happened near water, and all were reported between mid-June and early September, the same time frame as Sarah's disappearance. Authorities weren't interested in connections. The sheriff called a press conference to announce the stones were likely unrelated to the missing person case. They cited lack of fingerprints, no direct link to Sarah, and the fact that tourists had been known to copy indigenous symbols as pranks. The stones got boxed up and sent to a university archaeology lab, where they sat for months before anyone looked at them again. But someone kept tracking the symbols. Journal leaks from the sheriff's department show a deputy photographed more carvings near Emerald Bay 2 weeks after Sarah vanished. These weren't underwater. They were on a boulder 20 feet up a cliffside facing the lake. The photos show symbols arranged in a circle, with one central mark resembling what looked like a squiggly line with 3 dots. That exact symbol appears in a 1923 ethnographer's notes about Washoe Cave paintings, with the annotation "Do not disturb." I spoke to a boat captain who ferried researchers around the lake last summer. He swears he saw divers working near the original stone site months after the official investigation closed. When he radioed to ask if they needed help, they ignored him. The next day, that stretch of shoreline had temporary fencing around it. Parks Department records show no scheduled maintenance for that area at that time. The strangest detail came from a retired school teacher in Truckee. In 1987, her 3rd grade class took a field trip to D.L. Bliss State Park. A student came running back from the water's edge, saying he found a rock with pictures. The teacher went to look and saw 4 stones arranged in a square, each with carvings similar to the ones found in Sarah's case. She took a photo. Polaroids were new then, but when she got home, the image showed only blank stones. She assumed the kid had imagined the marks until she saw news reports about Sarah. The official file lists the stones as possibly historic artifacts, with a recommendation to notify local tribes. Nobody ever followed up. One deputy's handwritten note at the bottom of the final report says, "Spoke to Elder Charlie at Washoe office. He said leave it alone. Says we don't dig up graveyards, so why dig up warnings?" Nobody explained what that meant. The stones remain in storage, though the current archaeologist in charge won't return calls about them. A fisherman told me he still sees the stones sometimes when the water's extra clear. He says they move, not float or roll, more like they're in slightly different spots each time he passes over them. The lake's current isn't strong enough there to shift rocks of that size. He marks the locations on his GPS, but the coordinates never match up on subsequent trips. Last time we talked, he showed me his chart. Dozens of little dots scattered in no particular pattern across the lake's northwest shore. Except when I zoomed out, they loosely formed the same squiggly line as the symbol from the cliffside boulder. He didn't seem to notice until I pointed it out. Then he rolled up the map and changed the subject. The detective working Sarah's case first noticed the pattern when reviewing old missing persons files. He was looking for similarities, anything that might give them a lead. What he found was more unsettling than he expected. At least 7 women had vanished near Lake Tahoe under nearly identical circumstances since 1952. All were between 17 and 24 years old. All were last seen near the water at dusk. None left behind any signs of struggle. The earliest case was Kathy Miller, a 19-year-old waitress from South Lake Tahoe. She went for an evening swim in August 1952 and never came back. Witnesses said she waved to friends from the water before turning away suddenly, like she'd heard someone call her name. The search turned up nothing, not even her swimsuit. The police report lists one odd detail. Her towel was found folded neatly on a rock, dry and untouched. 20 years later, in 1973, a UCLA student named Lisa Cho disappeared while camping with friends near Emerald Bay. She stepped away to wash her face in the lake around sunset. Her roommate claimed Lisa paused halfway to the water, standing perfectly still for almost a minute before continuing. When she didn't return after 20 minutes, they checked the shoreline. Only her hairbrush lay at the water's edge, placed upright as if standing on its own. Dive teams searched for 3 days. Nothing. The files show most disappearances happened during summer months, usually July or August. The exceptions were 2 cases from 1987, Marta Gutierrez, who vanished in late June, and Jenna Colson, who disappeared in early September. Both were high school students visiting the lake with family. Marta's sister told police she turned her back for maybe 30 seconds while they were skipping stones near Sand Harbor. When she looked again, Marta was gone. Jenna's case was eerier. Security cameras at a nearby restaurant caught her walking toward the water alone at dusk. The footage shows her stopping abruptly about 10 feet from shore, tilting her head like she was listening to something. Then the camera glitched. When the feed came back 7 seconds later, she was gone. Law enforcement initially suspected a serial killer. The FBI profile suggested someone local, possibly a fisherman or campground worker, who knew the area well enough to avoid detection. But there were problems with this theory. No bodies ever surfaced, except once. In 1993, a hiker found the remains of Dawn Phelps, floating face up in a secluded cove. She'd been missing for 8 months. The coroner's report lists strangulation as cause of death, but the bizarre part was the body's condition. Despite spending months underwater, Dawn showed almost no signs of decomposition. Her skin was slightly bloated, but her facial features remained clearly recognizable. Even stranger, her clothes were perfectly intact. No tears, no missing buttons, not even significant fading. The case file notes her shirt collar was damp, but the rest of her clothing was dry. 5 years later, in 1998, another woman vanished, Rachel Stein, a 22-year-old bartender. She finished her shift at a lakeside restaurant and told co-workers she wanted to watch the sunset. Surveillance footage shows her walking toward the pier, then stopping suddenly about halfway down. Witnesses reported seeing her stand motionless for several minutes while the sky darkened. One customer told police Rachel's arms hung limp at her sides, her head tilted slightly upward. When security went to check on her 30 minutes later, only. Her shoes remained on the dock, placed neatly side by side. The FBI quietly reopened 3 of these cases after Sarah disappeared. They wouldn't confirm it officially, but a source in the Reno field office said they were looking at possible connections. The problem was the timeline. How could one killer operate undetected for nearly 70 years? Unless it wasn't one person, unless it wasn't a person at all. Details emerge when you look at the files side by side. 3 victims had small objects found near the water, not belongings they dropped, but items that shouldn't have been there. Lisa Cho's hairbrush in 1973. Marta Gutierrez's necklace found hanging from a tree branch in 1987. Sarah's damp hair elastic half a mile from shore. None of these items showed signs of being placed there violently. Quite the opposite. They all appeared carefully arranged. Family members of the missing women noticed other similarities. 4 separate parents described hearing their daughters talk about feeling watched near the lake in the days before disappearing. 2 mentioned strange marks appearing on their arms. Not bruises exactly, more like faint discolorations in spiral patterns. Medical records show Lisa Cho visited a dermatologist 3 days before she vanished, complaining of unexplained tingling on her forearm where the skin looked slightly darker. The doctor diagnosed it as a fungal infection and prescribed cream. Her parents found the unused tube in her bathroom cabinet after she disappeared. Police reports from each era show detectives considering then dismissing supernatural explanations. The 1952 file mentions locals telling investigators about water spirits, but the lead detective scribbled superstitious nonsense in the margin. The 1993 report notes that Dawn Phelps's body was found in water less than 3 feet deep, shallow enough that she should have been visible the entire time she was missing, unless something held her underwater elsewhere first. The coroner couldn't explain how her lungs showed no signs of drowning. Most disturbing is what happened to the evidence. Kathy Miller's towel disappeared from the police evidence locker in 1958. The necklace from Marta Gutierrez's case went missing in 1991. Dawn Phelps' clothing was destroyed in a storage flood 2 years after her death, a flood that left every other item in the room untouched. The security footage from Jenna Colson's disappearance was erased due to recording errors before investigators could make copies. The FBI agent currently assigned to review these cases declined to comment when I reached out. But a retired detective from the 1990s agreed to talk off the record. He said they always suspected something wasn't right with the lake itself. Not the water, not the wildlife, the location. He mentioned surveys showing unexplained magnetic anomalies along certain sections of shoreline. When I asked why they didn't pursue that angle, he shrugged. Nobody files charges against geography. Sarah's case file includes a sticky note with latitude and longitude numbers. When mapped, they correspond to a spot near Cave Rock, where 3 other women vanished. Nobody seems to know who put that note there, only that it appeared after the official investigation closed. The current sheriff denies any connection between the cases, but last month, county workers installed new warning signs along that stretch of shoreline. They say, "No swimming after dark," in bold letters. Nobody seems to remember who ordered them. The detectives had a lead, a man named Royce Wilkins, who'd been working odd jobs at the Tahoe Keys Marina that summer. He didn't show up for his shift the morning after Sarah disappeared. His landlord said he packed his truck in the middle of the night and left without notice. When they ran his name, The system lit up with hits from 3 other states. Wilkins had a record, nothing violent, mostly trespassing and public intoxication charges. But the addresses stuck out. He'd lived briefly near Lake Champlain in Vermont when a college student vanished there in 2012. He'd worked at a boat rental place on Lake Powell when a tourist went missing in 2015. And he'd been passing through Crater Lake National Park when another young woman disappeared in 2018. The cases were all cold, but the similarities were hard to ignore. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit got involved. Their profile suggested someone who knew how to move unseen around water, not a hunter. None of the victims showed signs of being stalked or chased. More like someone who waited, who understood patterns. The agent in charge pointed out that lakeside disappearances often get written off as accidents, especially if no body surfaces. It would be the perfect hunting ground for someone patient. Forensic accountants traced Wilkins' movements through storage unit rentals. He never stayed anywhere more than 6 months, but he always rented a small unit to store belongings between jobs. The one near Tahoe was still sealed when deputies broke in. Inside they found fishing gear, waterlogged clothing that didn't match Wilkins' size, and a tackle box full of Polaroid photos. Most showed normal lakeside scenery, but 7 images stood out, each featuring a young woman in the distance, unaware she was being photographed. None matched known victims, but the timestamps put all 7 pictures within a month of disappearances in their respective locations. The storage unit also contained a notebook with page after page of handwritten entries. Wilkins documented weather conditions, lake temperatures, even moon phases. Certain dates had circles around them, including the day Sarah vanished. The notes weren't confessional, just observational. One page read, "South Shore at dusk, ideal conditions again." Another said, "They always pause before entering." Strange how they never look back. Wilkins got picked up 2 months later at a roadside motel near Flathead Lake in Montana. He didn't resist arrest. Police found his truck freshly washed, the bed lined with plastic sheeting. A duffel bag in the cab contained rope, duct tape, and a wetsuit folded neatly beneath his clothes. His phone had maps of every major lake in the Rockies with small blue dots marking certain spots along the shoreline. When asked about the dots, he said they were good fishing holes. Interrogation tapes show Wilkins calm at first, then frustrated when pressed about Sarah. He admitted being in Tahoe that summer, but claimed he left because the lake got weird. Asked to elaborate, he said the water changed color some nights, that fish would disappear from certain areas for no reason. The detectives thought he was deflecting until he mentioned the stones. How did Wilkins know about the marked stones? They'd never released that detail to the press. The storage unit photos got sent to labs for enhancement. One image showed what looked like fabric caught on a branch, possibly a piece of clothing. Another captured a woman mid-step near the water's edge, her posture eerily similar to Sarah's last sighting. The most unsettling photo showed a stretch of empty shoreline with fresh footprints leading into the lake, but none coming back out. Wilkins' trial for the Montana charges, unrelated to Tahoe, ended with a conviction for attempted abduction. He got 15 years, but local prosecutors couldn't make the Tahoe case stick. Sarah's parents sat through every hearing, hoping for some confession, some sign Wilkins knew what happened. He never gave them one. On his last day in court, when the judge asked if he had anything to say to the families of the missing women, Wilkins shook his head. Then, just before the bailiffs led him away, he muttered something that didn't get picked up by microphones. but was overheard by the court reporter. "They're still out there, under the water. You'll see." Back in Tahoe, detectives kept digging. They found Wilkins had clocked out of work 40 minutes before Sarah was last seen. Security footage from a gas station near the lake showed his truck passing by around that time, headed toward the general area where Sarah vanished. But without definitive evidence, the case against him stalled. A forensic linguist compared Wilkins' notebook entries to letters sent to newspapers near other lakes after disappearances. One sent to the Adirondack Daily Enterprise in 2013 read, "You'll never find her where you're looking. The deep parts move." It matched Wilkins' phrasing patterns exactly. Still, without fingerprints or DNA, it wasn't enough. The last strange detail came from Wilkins' Montana motel room. Housekeeping reported finding the bathroom mirror covered in what looked like lake water droplets. When they wiped it clean, faint marks appeared on the glass. Not fingerprints, but wavy lines that evaporated within minutes. The sheriff's deputy who responded said in his report that the shape reminded him of something, but he couldn't place it until later. When he checked the Tahoe case files, he realized it matched the squiggly symbol from the marked stones. Wilkins sits in Montana State Prison now, coming up for parole in 6 years. He still writes letters to fishing magazines, still talks about lakes like they're living things. When a reporter asked him last year if he knew what happened to Sarah, he folded his hands and said, "Some places keep their secrets better than people do." Then he asked for a glass of water and didn't speak again for the rest of the interview. The Washoe people have stories about this lake that go back further than written records. Their elders talk about rules that have never changed. Never take water after dark. Never turn your back on the lake at sunset. Never answer if you hear your name called from the water. One elder I spoke to said his grandfather told him about shapes that moved against the current, visible only in the corner of your eye. When you turned to look directly, there'd be nothing there. Modern boat captains still follow some of these old rules without even thinking about it. Marty, who's run fishing charters here for 30 years, told me he instinctively avoids certain coves after 4 p.m. He can't explain why, just says it doesn't feel right. His logbooks show he's never caught a single fish in those spots despite perfect conditions. Other fishermen report the same thing. Areas where lines go slack, where sonar shows nothing swimming despite ideal habitats. Marty says it's like the fish know something he doesn't. An ethnographer from UNR documented these traditions in the 1970s. Her notebooks describe Washoe stories about the deep parts that walk. Some accounts mention water turning thick like sap in certain spots, trapping animals that wandered too close. Others describe lights that rose from the lake on summer nights, hovering briefly before sinking again. The tribes had special songs they'd sing before gathering water plants, rituals to keep the lake sleeping. Modern equipment has picked up anomalies that match some of these stories. A 2012 sonar survey by the U.S. Geological Survey found areas where sound waves bounced back oddly, not like rocks or debris, but something with an irregular texture. The researchers wrote it off as gas bubbles at first, but the patterns didn't match known methane vents. One technician's field notes mentioned seeing shapes almost like fingers on the screen before the image scrambled. They never got a clear reading from that spot again. 4 years ago, a documentary crew filmed underwater near Cave Rock. Their equipment included high-intensity lights that could illuminate deep water. The camera operator swore he captured something moving just beyond the light's range, not a fish, but something larger that disturbed the sediment. When they reviewed the footage later, there was a 3-second gap where the image cut to static. Right before it cut out, the audio picked up what sounded like multiple objects striking the hull from below. The Coast Guard confiscated the footage without explanation after the crew reported it. People who live here have their own theories. A bartender at a lakeside restaurant told me about guests who'd see shadows passing under their boats. Shadows too big to be fish. One family left mid-meal after their daughter pointed to the water and asked who the smiling lady was beneath their dock. Nobody else saw anything. The bartender said this happens a few times each summer. He stopped asking questions when customers suddenly request their checks after staring at the water too long. Scientists have tried explaining these stories. The official stance is that methane gas from decaying plant matter causes hallucinations when it bubbles to the surface. A geologist from UC Davis showed me charts of underwater fissures that release gases. He said the lake's clarity makes depths deceptive, that our brains try to make sense of light distortions we don't consciously notice. But when I asked why these effects only seem to happen in specific locations, the same ones mentioned in Washoe stories, he changed the subject to plankton migrations. Divers report stranger things than scientists acknowledge. One woman who helps clean boat propellers described descending into perfectly clear water that suddenly went murky for no reason. Visibility dropped from 30 feet to 0 in seconds. She said it felt thicker than silt, like swimming through fog. Her dive computer recorded normal conditions the entire time. Another diver quit after an experience near the Rubicon Wall, where he swears something massive passed beneath him outside the range of his light. Not a fish, not a log. He described the movement as deliberate. Night brings more stories. Security guards at lakeside resorts mention guests who check out early after reporting noises from the docks. One guard's logbook lists 18 instances in 3 years where people claim to hear knocking sounds coming from under their boats. Maintenance crews never find damage or animals that could explain it. The guard told me they've started moving these guests to inland rooms without discussing why. The most convincing account came from a marine biologist studying algae blooms. She set up time-lapse cameras to monitor water conditions. One camera, positioned near a known gas vent, captured something unexpected at 3:17 a.m. The image shows what looks like a disturbance moving against the current, not bubbles rising, but something horizontal displacing water. It lasted 7 seconds before vanishing. Her report claims it was probably a sediment slide, but her handwritten notes say, unlike any slide pattern in literature. The university later reassigned her to a different project. Science offers explanations for individual incidents, but the patterns persist. A park ranger showed me maps with X's marking where visitors most often report feeling uneasy near the water. Many overlap with Washoe warnings passed down for generations. The ranger wouldn't go on record about it, but he admitted they rotate patrol schedules, so no one has to walk certain stretches of shoreline at night too often. Researchers recently deployed a new type of sonar that creates 3D images of the lakebed. The preliminary scans show a series of unusual depressions near the deepest part of the lake. Not natural formations, but not man-made either. The lead scientist called them geological anomalies in her official report, but privately told colleagues they resembled giant versions of the symbols found on those marked stones. The full findings haven't been released yet. When I asked the research team for comment, they said the data was still being analyzed, but their boat has been spotted multiple nights this month, anchored over those same deep spots. Lights shining down into water that's supposedly empty. The search dogs arrived on the second morning. 3 German shepherds trained specifically for water recoveries, each with over 200 successful finds under their collars. Their handlers started working the shoreline near where Sarah was last seen. The dogs picked up her scent immediately, then stopped dead at the water's edge, not hesitating, not casting about for the next step, just planted. One handler's report says, "It was like hitting an invisible wall. They wouldn't even sniff past a certain point. They tried redirecting the dogs to different approach angles. Same result. The animals would follow the scent trail right up to the waterline, then refused to go farther. One handler attempted to lead his dog into the shallows by leash. He described the dog digging its paws into the sand like we were walking toward a wildfire. When he tugged harder, the dog did something unprecedented. It rolled onto its back in the submissive posture it hadn't used since basic puppy training. The team regrouped in the parking lot, thinking maybe the dogs needed a reset. They brought out Sarah's pajama top from her apartment for a fresh scent sample. This time, one dog didn't just refuse. It backed away whining, tail tucked between its legs. Another handler noted in his log, "Dog number 3, Ava, exhibiting avoidance behaviors not seen in 7 years of fieldwork. No physical threats present. Possibly reacting to submerged chemical deposits." They checked water quality reports later. Nothing unusual for that stretch of shoreline. Around noon, they tried a new strategy, approaching from the forest instead of the beach. The theory was that if Sarah had walked parallel to shore before entering the water, the dogs might pick up that trail first. This worked initially. 2 dogs led their handlers about 30 yards into the woods, then abruptly veered left toward a cluster of boulders, and that's when things got stranger. The lead dog, a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois named Rex, froze about 5 feet from the rocks. His handler described how every hair on his back stood straight up. Then Rex did something none of them had ever seen. He dropped his nose to the ground and backed away step by step without turning around, like retreating from a predator. When he reached his handler, he lay flat with his paws over his eyes. The search had to pause for 20 minutes while they calmed him down. They decided to try one last sweep before calling it. That's when the youngest dog, a 2-year-old bloodhound named Blue, bolted. The handler said her grip on the leash felt yanked downward first, like something pulled it toward the ground, before Blue snapped his collar and took off running. They heard him crashing through brush for about 30 seconds, then silence. Blue had perfect recall training. He'd never ignored a come command before. They searched for 3 hours before finding Blue nearly 4 miles away, standing guard. Over a small clearing, not exhausted like a runaway dog should be. Alert, pacing circles around a patch of bare dirt. When his handler approached, Blue didn't wag his tail or come running like normal. He planted himself between her and the clearing, growling low in his throat until she stopped moving. The handler's report notes, subject would not allow approach or retrieval. Required tossing treats to distract while another handler approached from opposite side. The clearing itself showed nothing unusual, just dirt and some pine needles. But Blue's GPS collar showed his path didn't make sense. Instead of running in a straight line or following animal trails, he'd zigzagged through dense brush at full speed, never slowing for obstacles. The route included crossing a 5-foot-deep ravine the handlers couldn't navigate without climbing gear. Yet Blue showed no signs of injury. A canine behaviorist reviewed the footage later. She identified 14 separate instances of the dogs displaying conflict behaviors not seen in their training records. Lip licking, yawning, even one case of a dog sneezing repeatedly. Her notes conclude, subjects reacting to stimuli handlers cannot perceive. Not scent-related, possibly infrasound or magnetic anomalies causing discomfort. She referenced a 2014 study where search dogs behave similarly near underground power lines emitting low-frequency vibrations. Other cases show similar animal reactions. A 2002 search in the Sierra foothills reported dogs refusing to enter a cave where a hiker later turned up unharmed. The hiker claimed to have seen shadow shapes moving on the walls before rescue. A 2017 avalanche recovery in Colorado had dogs whining and backing away from certain snow patches despite strong human scent markers beneath them. None of these incidents were ever fully explained. What finally made the team switch to drones wasn't just the dog's behavior. It was what happened afterward. All 3 dogs failed their recertification test the following month. Rex, who'd never missed a find in his career, started skipping obvious scent trails. Blue developed a fear of water so severe he'd panic during bath time. The 3rd dog began sleeping with its eyes open, a nervous behavior it hadn't shown since puppyhood. Their handler retired them from fieldwork altogether 6 weeks later. The drones had their own issues. Interference near the same areas the dogs avoided. Battery drains that shouldn't have happened at those altitudes. But at least they didn't develop psychological trauma. One sheriff's deputy joked darkly that maybe the lake didn't like being watched. His report includes an addendum about finding Blue's snapped collar 2 days later. It wasn't where he ran from the handlers. It was back at the original search site, placed neatly atop one of the marked stones at the water's edge. The deputy's note simply says, "No human prints around stone. Collar dry." The volunteer photographer noticed it first. He'd taken over 200 shots during the search, standard procedure to document the area. When he reviewed them that night, 3 images stood out. One showed what looked like a human silhouette standing between trees about 50 yards from shore. Not a searcher. They'd cleared those woods hours earlier. Another captured a reflection in still water that didn't match anything visible on the bank. The 3rd had streaks of light near the lake bed that shouldn't have been there at that depth. He showed the anomalies to the deputy in charge, who shrugged and said it was probably lens flare. By morning, those 3 photos were corrupted. Not just deleted. The file still existed but showed nothing but digital noise. The photographer checked his backup SD card. Same corruption. His cloud storage, which automatically uploaded the shots in real time, also showed damaged files. The weird part, only those 3 images were affected. The other 197 photos remained perfectly clear. A digital forensics team from the sheriff's office tried recovering the files. Their report states the corruption followed no known pattern. Normally, when files corrupt, you can still salvage fragments or at least identify the corruption method. These showed no traces of malware, no hardware failures, no signs of tampering. One technician told me off the record, "It's like the pixels decided to rearrange themselves. They sent samples to an FBI lab in Quantico. The response came back 2 weeks later. Inconclusive. No known technical explanation. Tech experts I consulted said this shouldn't happen. Cloud backups have multiple redundancies. If one server corrupts, others preserve the data." One specialist from a major photo hosting site explained that for cloud files to corrupt simultaneously with local storage would require either a coordinated hack targeting specific images or some kind of electromagnetic pulse focused solely on those files. Neither made sense here. The photographer's camera was a professional grade D SLR, less than 6 months old. He'd used it on dozens of assignments without issue. When he tested it the next day, all functions worked perfectly. The sheriff's department borrowed it for a week, shooting hundreds of test images around the lake. Only one batch showed problems, pictures taken near the same cluster of marked stones divers found earlier. Those images also corrupted within 12 hours. Stranger still was the one photo that remained intact. It showed nothing but empty lake surface. No shoreline, no people, just water meeting sky. The photographer didn't remember taking that particular shot. His camera's timestamp placed it at 4:17 p.m., right when search teams were packing up for the day. When enhanced, the image revealed faint concentric circles near the center, like something had briefly disturbed the surface. Not waves, the pattern was too symmetrical. Sonar readings from that time show nothing unusual at that location. Investigators eventually wrote it off as equipment malfunction. Their official statement cited environmental factors potentially affecting digital storage media. They didn't explain what those factors might be. The case file includes a note from the lead detective. No evidentiary value in technical glitches. But the photographer kept digging on his own. He discovered something the reports didn't mention. Similar incidents during previous searches. In 2008, a news crew filming a documentary about Lake Tahoe's depth lost 30 minutes of footage near Cave Rock. The camera kept running, but the tape showed only static for that segment. In 2015, a tourist's GoPro stopped working precisely when it captured what she swore was a human shape moving beneath a fishing pier. Her attempts to recover the file caused her laptop to crash. I tracked down a retired park ranger who worked Tahoe for 20 years. He remembered a 1999 case where a hiker disappeared near Eagle Lake. Search teams took photos that developed with strange light streaks, not lens flares, but organized patterns the lab couldn't explain. Those negatives later vanished from the evidence locker. The ranger said, "Weird stuff happens around here with cameras. Always has." Modern devices seem especially vulnerable. Last year, a YouTuber trying to film Tahoe's haunted spots had his drone camera fail the moment it passed over the deep shelf area. His backup camera, a different make and model, also froze at the same location. The footage shows both devices' error messages appearing simultaneously despite being unconnected. Comments on his video reveal at least 7 other people experienced identical failures in that spot. The intact lake surface photo eventually ended up with a paranormal research group. They analyzed it using spectral imaging software normally reserved for astronomical photos. Their unpublished report claims the concentric circles exhibit non-fluid dynamics, meaning the pattern doesn't match how water naturally moves. One researcher compared it to disturbances seen in lab experiments with high-frequency sound waves, but admitted nothing in nature produces that exact effect. What bothers me isn't the corrupted files. Technology fails sometimes. It's the selectivity. Only certain images degrade, always ones showing potential anomalies. Always near the same locations. Always with no recoverable data. The photographer told me his camera's sensor logged over 200,000 shutter actuations before and after this incident without a single error. The sheriff's department still has that one clear photo in their files, marked unrelated landscape. No one can explain why it survived when others didn't. The photographer quit journalism 6 months later and moved to Arizona. When I asked why, he said he kept seeing that silhouette from his corrupted photo. Not in the woods, but in the corners of other images he took, always blurred, always gone when he looked directly. His last Facebook post before deactivating his account showed a picture of his new backyard with the caption, "No water for miles, finally sleeping through the night." The journalist noticed it first, a pattern others had missed. Reviewing old newspaper archives, she plotted every lakeside disappearance since 1952 on a map. The dots formed a near-perfect circle around the lake's deepest point, an area divers describe as where light goes to die. The dates showed another connection, all clustered within 3 days of a full moon. Not every full moon, but consistently every 4 to 7 years, like clockwork. An astronomer from Stanford ran the numbers. He calculated that the odds of this alignment happening randomly were about 1 in 12,500. The lunar connection made some sense. Tides affect all large bodies of water, even landlocked ones like Tahoe. But the pattern's precision didn't match known tidal forces. His notes mention anomalous correlation between lunar perigee events and incident dates, meaning the disappearances tended to happen when the moon was closest to Earth. Police records revealed something stranger. 3 of the missing women had been menstruating when they vanished, according to toxicology reports from their last medical visits. 2 others had appointments scheduled for fertility treatments the following week. The journalist found this detail buried in old case files. Nobody had thought to connect it before. One biologist suggested this might matter if whatever happened involved scent tracking, but the idea was dismissed. The next date in the cycle fell 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance. The journalist notified the sheriff's department, who grudgingly agreed to stake out the predicted hotspot, a stretch of shoreline near Rubicon Point. Their surveillance logs show nothing unusual for most of the night. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the thermal cameras picked up a sudden temperature drop in one spot near the water, not gradual like normal cooling, but instant, from 62 degrees Fahrenheit to 41 degrees Fahrenheit in under 30 seconds. Deputies on scene reported their breath visible in the suddenly cold air. One officer's body cam captured audio of what sounded like stone scraping against stone from the lake direction. The footage shows him turning toward the noise, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. For about 12 seconds, the camera's night vision mode showed dozens of small, round shapes breaking the surface out past the shore. Not fish jumping. The movements were too synchronized. Then the camera glitched. When it came back online, the temperature was normal again. The official report calls it a microclimate anomaly. They cited similar recorded incidents around the lake where cold air gets trapped near the surface. The stone scraping noise was attributed to geothermal activity, despite Tahoe having no known hot springs. The circular shapes in the water got one sentence: possible school of spawning cockney salmon. The biologist who reviewed the footage disagreed. Salmon don't surface en masse at 3 a.m., and certainly not in perfect formation. I tracked down the deputy who'd been closest to the water that night. He retired 6 months later and refused to speak on record. Off camera, he described feeling watched from below during the incident. His notes mention an overwhelming urge to step into the lake that passed as suddenly as it came. The sheriff reassigned him to desk duty the next day, citing unevaluated stress reactions. Statisticians argue that humans naturally find patterns where none exist. They point to the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, firing bullets randomly at a barn, then drawing targets around the clusters after the fact. But the lunar cycle correlation holds up under mathematical scrutiny. A data scientist from Berkeley ran Monte Carlo simulations showing the dates aligning too precisely for coincidence. His paper was rejected by 3 journals before being published on a research aggregate site. Editors called it overfitting data to narrative. What the journalist didn't report at first was the second pattern she found. When she mapped not just disappearances but all unusual lake incidents, boat malfunctions, sonar glitches, even corruption events like the search photos, they clustered along spokes radiating from the deep point like clock hands. The dates of these minor events filled in the gaps between major disappearances, forming what looked like a countdown. The night after presenting her findings to the sheriff's department, someone broke into her car. Nothing was stolen except her notebook with the pattern diagrams. A deputy responding to the break-in report found tire tracks leading down to the water's edge and stopping abruptly, like the vehicle had driven straight in. But no cars were reported missing that week. The sheriff held a press conference calling the lunar theory creative fiction. They released a statement that 83% of Tahoe drownings happen in daylight hours with no lunar correlation. What they didn't mention is that all those recovered bodies showed normal drowning pathology, unlike the missing women, whose lone recovered victim showed no water in her lungs at all. 3 days after the predicted event date, hikers found a new arrangement of stones near D.L. Bliss State Park. These weren't submerged like the others. They sat stacked in a spiral on an overlook 200 feet above the waterline. Tribal elders confirmed the pattern matched warning markers from oral traditions, but refused to elaborate. Park rangers dismantled the structure before photos could circulate. One ranger's wife later confided he washed his hands raw after touching those stones, though they appeared perfectly clean. The journalist keeps updating her map whenever new incidents occur. The dots keep clustering where predicted. Another full moon passes in 3 weeks. Local boat rental shops report a surge in cancellations for those dates, though nobody will say why on record. One marina manager told me, "People know. They just know." His logbook shows every single no-show customer cited family emergencies as their reason. Park rangers now schedule extra staffing around full moons. Their memos don't mention why, just note increased visitor safety concerns. The sheriff's department insists this is standard procedure for summer tourism season. Their patrol logs tell a different story. Most entries from these shifts simply read, "all quiet." But 3 separate reports mention officers monitoring specific shoreline sectors per protocol, without explaining what the protocol is for. A retired dispatcher told me the radio chatter changes during these patrols. Normally, officers joke around during night shifts, but on these dates, the channels stay silent except for mandatory check-ins. She remembered one transmission from 2017 where a deputy whispered, "It's not a person," before his mic cut out. When she tried calling back, he claimed he'd said, "There's no person here." His voice reportedly shook for the rest of his shift. The journalist keeps her current mapping project private now, just a spreadsheet and a laminated map in her home office. The last time we spoke, she mentioned adding a new variable, elevation above lake level. Preliminary results show incidents cluster not just around the deep point geographically, but along an exact altitude contour line ringing the basin. She won't say what altitude, only that it matches something from Washoe creation stories about where sky remembers water. Predictive models suggest the next major event window opens in 17 months. The journalist won't be there. She moved to Idaho last winter, but she still mails updated charts to a P.O. box in Truckee every solstice and equinox. The box's owner, a retired geologist, uses them to plan his fishing trips. He hasn't set foot near the lake after dark in 9 years. The survivor didn't come forward until she saw Sarah's picture on the news. Her name was Hannah Cho, and she'd been 16 years old when she walked into Lake Tahoe one August evening in 2011. She emerged 3 hours later, a quarter-mile down the shore, with no memory of what happened. The first thing her brother noticed was her hair, streaks of white running through her previously jet-black ponytail. Strands that hadn't just lightened, but turned completely colorless overnight. Hannah's family didn't report the incident at first. They thought maybe she'd hit her head, gotten confused. But when Sarah's disappearance made headlines 6 years later, Hannah contacted the private investigator Sarah's parents had hired. She said the details were too similar. The time of day, how still the water looked, the way Sarah's clothes didn't match swimming weather. The PI arranged for Hannah to undergo hypnosis with a therapist who specialized in recovered memories. The transcripts from those sessions read like something from a horror movie. Under hypnosis, Hannah described wading knee-deep into the lake to cool off after a hike. She remembered the water feeling wrong, not cold exactly, but thick, like moving through syrup. Then she noticed lights below the surface. Not reflections, not bioluminescence. She insisted they moved with purpose, circling her legs in slow spirals. Her voice on the recording grows shaky as she describes one light rising toward her, close enough that it should have touched me, but it didn't. That's when her account gets fragmentary. She repeats the phrase, "they sing," 7 times before the therapist brings her out of the trance. Medical records show Hannah was hospitalized overnight after her initial disappearance. Doctors found no signs of head trauma, no drugs in her system, no explanation for the memory loss or hair pigmentation changes. A dermatologist consulted on the case noted the white streaks followed no known pattern for vitiligo or stress-induced poliosis. The roots showed no gradation, just abrupt transitions from black to white at the follicle level. Blood work revealed elevated levels of an unidentified protein that resembled certain deep-sea fish antibodies. The lab annotated the report with possible specimen contamination and never followed up. Hannah's physical recovery took weeks. She suffered migraines triggered by sunlight reflecting off water. Showers made her dizzy unless she kept the bathroom dark. The white hair never regained pigment. Those strands stopped falling out after the first month. Psych evaluations deemed her mentally sound with no history of hallucinations. Her therapist diagnosed dissociative amnesia, but noted Hannah showed unusual resistance to standard memory recovery techniques. The private investigator tracked down the EMTs who'd responded to Hannah's 911 call. One recalled the girl's clothing being wrong for someone who'd been in the lake. Not just dry in places, her sneakers showed no moisture inside despite having been laced tightly when found. Another odd detail. Hannah's watch had stopped at 7:18 p.m., the approximate time she entered the water, but started working again after being removed from her wrist. The EMT who pocketed it briefly described feeling ice cold. Through his uniform before the watch suddenly warmed to body temperature on its own. For 5 years after the incident, Hannah avoided Lake Tahoe entirely. She moved to Sacramento for college, changed her major from marine biology to accounting. Then Sarah vanished. That's when Hannah started remembering things, not under hypnosis, but in dreams. She told the PI about one recurring nightmare where she stood on a lake bed among stone pillars, watching shapes move in dark water above her. Always the same detail. Her hair floating around her face, white strands glowing faintly while the black ones remained invisible. The PI arranged a second hypnosis session after these dreams started. This time, Hannah described seeing other figures underwater with her, not people, but human-shaped voids where the water appeared thicker. She recalled one reaching for her before the lights intervened. The therapist's notes include the phrase, possible submerged gas hallucinations. But Hannah insisted the memory felt more real than her normal recollections. 3 days after that second session, Hannah missed her scheduled follow-up call with the PI. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle, just an empty coffee cup in the sink, her laptop open to a map of Lake Tahoe with one spot circled near Rubicon Point. Neighbors reported hearing Hannah leave around sunset, but no one saw her actual departure. Security cameras in the parking lot malfunctioned between 6:45 and 7:20 p.m. The only possible clue, muddy footprints leading from Hannah's front door to the curb, but stopping abruptly as if she'd been picked up mid-step. Hannah's case file remains open in Sacramento, but the lead investigator admits they've hit dead ends. Her parents keep a photo of her on their mantle from before the incident. Black hair, smiling at the camera. Another from after shows the white streaks. They told me Hannah sometimes calls them late at night, but the calls show up as unknown on caller ID and last only a minute or two. Her mother claims Hannah keeps repeating the same phrase before the line cuts out. They're singing again. Calls to phone companies confirm no record of these calls being placed. The therapist who conducted the hypnosis sessions reviewed her notes after Hannah disappeared. She found an odd addition she didn't remember writing. A diagram of a spiral with symbols at each curve matching those found on the Lake Tahoe stones. When asked about it, she said it must have been added after her last session with Hannah. Security footage from her office shows no one entered the file room between the session and when she discovered the drawing. Hannah's story appears in Sarah's case file as possible unrelated incident. The sheriff's department never followed up with the Sacramento PD or requested Hannah's medical records. When pressed, one detective admitted off the record they have enough local weirdness without importing more. The PI continues searching on his own, though he won't say where. Last time we spoke, he mentioned checking abandoned mines near the lake, but clammed up when I asked why. His phone now goes straight to voicemail every full moon. His secretary says he takes personal days around those dates, something he never did before taking Hannah's case. The sheriff's daughter found the journal while cleaning out his home office after his funeral. At first she thought it was just an old case notebook. Retirement gifts often included unused office supplies, but when she flipped through it, she realized these entries dated from years after he'd left the force. The first page read, "They think I've stopped looking. Good." Most entries were brief, written in his tight police shorthand, but some passages stood out. Long, looping script that didn't match his normal handwriting. One, dated 3 months after Sarah's disappearance, described seeing her face in the water near Cave Rock at sunset. The entry continued. Not a reflection. Not a body. Just her features forming in the ripples for about 5 seconds before dissipating. Went back next day with Tina, the daughter. She saw it too. Won't speak of it again. Forensic document examiners confirmed the journal was authentic. The same blue ink ran through all pages, though some entries showed darker saturation where he'd pressed harder. A graphologist noted the looping script matched his handwriting under stress, something seen in his old interrogation notes when cases turned personal. The journal paper tested negative for chemicals that could indicate forgery. Psychologists who reviewed excerpts suggested typical trauma responses in law enforcement. Hypervigilance morphing into paranoia, guilt manifesting as obsession. The department's staff therapist pointed out the sheriff had worked 3 drowning cases before Sarah's disappearance. His notes from those investigations showed similar patterns of circling back to unresolved details, but none mentioned apparitions. The journal's chronology jumped around. Normal case notes interspersed with personal entries spanning years. One page, dated a full decade after Sarah vanished, described finding the stones again. Different markings this time, during a fishing trip near Emerald Bay. He'd drawn the symbols carefully, then scribbled them out so hard the paper tore in places. A later entry read, "Asked Charlie, tribal elder, about new shapes. He told me to throw tobacco in the lake and never ask again. Did it. Still seeing them in dreams." His daughter recalled finding wet footprints on the dock after these fishing trips, always leading from the shoreline to where he kept his gear in the garage. She assumed he'd stepped in puddles, but his boots would be dry. Sometimes she heard him whispering to someone in his study late at night. When she asked who he was talking to, he'd say, "Just reviewing statements." The final entries got darker. 6 months before his death, he wrote, "They're not hiding from us. They're hiding us from something else." 3 pages later, found the names, all 7 of them. Dates match lunar charts going back to 52. How did I miss this? His handwriting grew shaky, letters overlapping where his pen strokes wavered. The last legible entry dated 2 weeks before his fatal heart attack. "Going to the place tonight. Bringing the old evidence box. Either I prove it or this ends." The following pages were torn out. His daughter found shreds of paper in the fireplace that wouldn't burn completely. Fragments showing partial symbols matching those from the stones. After his death, rangers found his truck parked at D.L. Bliss State Park with the driver's door open. His fishing gear lay neatly arranged on the passenger seat. A thermos of coffee sat on the dash, still warm. Search teams combed the area for 3 days before calling it off. The coroner listed natural causes despite no body being recovered. His personal effects included a locked metal box containing files on 7 missing persons cases. Newspaper clippings showed dates circled in red, every 4 to 7 years like clockwork. A map had precise locations marked with the same symbols from the lake stones. Forensic analysis showed fingerprint powder residue on the documents. He'd apparently accessed sealed case files after retirement. The strangest discovery came when his daughter sorted his bookshelf. Behind his law enforcement manuals sat a thin volume titled Washoe Water Traditions. Inside were handwritten notes describing rituals involving spiral patterns and moon phases. One margin note read, "Why always women?" Another said simply, "They hear better." Psychiatrists consulted after the fact suggested the journal represented a grieving mind seeking patterns where none existed. But a cultural anthropologist who reviewed the material noted several symbols matched obscure tribal warnings about the deep parts that walk. When pressed, she admitted such traditions often derive from observable phenomena, meaning the sheriff might have been investigating something real. The family donated the journal to a paranormal research group specializing in missing persons cases. Their initial analysis confirmed the ink-matched pen sold only to law enforcement agencies. They also noted faint impressions on torn-out pages. When scanned with forensic lighting, these showed partial sketches of humanoid shapes with elongated limbs. One researcher attempted to follow the sheriff's final steps. He camped at D.L. Bliss on the date corresponding to the next event in the cycle. His own notes describe sudden temperature drops and equipment malfunctions near the shoreline, but no apparitions. When asked why he didn't publish these findings, he said the recording devices had all failed at critical moments, just like in the original case files. A deputy who served under the sheriff recalled him staring at the lake during twilight patrols. Never took his eyes off the water, the deputy said. Even when paperwork piled up, he'd make time to walk the shore before sunset. I figured he just liked the view. The sheriff's fishing boat was found drifting near Rubicon Point a month after his disappearance. The anchor line was neatly coiled on deck, unused. His daughter identified his favorite hat lying dry on the seat, suggesting it hadn't blown off in wind. Rangers noted the boat's position made no sense. Currents should have carried it farther south by that time. His retirement plaque still hangs in the sheriff's office lobby. The engraving reads, 25 years of service. Current deputies say sometimes, around dusk, the plaque feels colder than the surrounding wall. Maintenance logs show no HVAC issues in that area. One overnight janitor reported finding the frame slightly askew every few weeks, always straightened by morning staff. Geological surveys of Lake Tahoe show more than just water. Beneath the surface lies a network of caves and tunnels that have been forming for thousands of years. Some connect to openings in the surrounding forests, hidden among rocks and under tree roots. Divers have mapped parts of these systems over decades, but their full extent remains unknown. A team from the U.S. Geological Survey conducted sonar scans in 2018 that revealed something unexpected, chambers not shown on any previous charts. These spaces appeared suddenly in the scans, as if the equipment had momentarily pierced through some interference. When they tried to rescan the same areas, some passages had shifted or disappeared from the readings entirely. One member of the team noted in his log, "Either the equipment is faulty, or the lake bottom isn't as stable as we thought." Spelunkers who've explored the dry portions of the cave systems near the shore report sounds that don't belong. One veteran caver described hearing what sounded like distant singing when he was half a mile inside a tunnel in 2015. The noise didn't echo the way cave sound should. Instead, it seemed to move, shifting positions without getting louder or softer. His headlamp also flickered at the same time, though the battery was fresh. Another explorer, who asked not to be named, said his group once found a chamber with walls too smooth to be natural. When they returned a year later with better equipment to document it, they couldn't find the room again. The tunnel they'd used to reach it now ended in a solid rock wall. The most recent sonar imaging revealed more anomalies. A research vessel from UC Davis picked up massive hollow spaces deep below the lake bed, far larger than standard erosion patterns could explain. Their scans suggested open chambers big enough to hold multiple houses, some with what looked like connecting passageways. The lead scientist called them geological oddities in the official report, but added a footnote stating they may have been carved by unverified hydrothermal activity. Local tribes were not surprised when news of the discovery spread. One Washoe elder simply said, "We've always known the lake has other rooms." A commercial diver working on a cable repair in 2019 claimed to have seen one of the tunnel entrances up close. He said the opening looked almost man-made, with a perfectly oval shape at about 120 feet down. Currents near it behaved strangely, pulling inward instead of flowing normally. His dive light malfunctioned when he got within 15 feet, so he couldn't see inside. When he reported it to his supervisor, the GPS coordinates for the work order were accidentally deleted. He still has his handwritten notes, though. They describe something moving in the dark just beyond the tunnel mouth. Not a fish, but something bigger. He said it didn't swim so much as drift, like it was waiting for him to come closer. By 2021, authorities had heard enough. Citing safety concerns, the Forest Service announced the official closure of all known cave access points around the lake. Rangers installed steel gates over the most accessible entrances and posted warnings about unstable geology. But those who know the area well say the measures weren't just about preventing accidents. One retired ranger told me, "You don't weld shut a cave system just because it's dangerous. You do it because you don't want something coming out." His statement didn't make it into the official records. A local hiking guide still leads tours near some of the gated caves. He won't take people inside, but he shows them where the entrances used to be. Last summer, one of his clients took a photo of what looked like wet footprints leading away from a sealed cave mouth. Except the ground was bone dry, and the gate hadn't been opened in years. The guide now refuses to visit that spot after dark. Researchers have tried twice to get approval for expeditions into the underwater sections. Both proposals were denied, one for excessive risk, the other with no explanation at all. An archaeology student who worked on one of the failed applications told me that maps kept changing between submissions. Nothing major, just small shifts in tunnel paths, like the lake itself didn't want to be mapped accurately. The last team to legally enter the caves was a geological survey group in 2020. Their final report has a single redacted page where the findings should be. The lead scientist has since moved to Norway and won't answer questions about the project. When pressed, he once muttered something about impossible pressure differentials before changing the subject. His field assistant quit geology altogether and now works at a hardware store in Reno. Boaters sometimes report disturbances over the deepest trenches, sudden swirls with no wind to cause them, or brief patches where the water looks darker than it should. Fishermen avoid those areas, saying the fish there taste wrong anyway. One marina worker told me the lake's underground tunnels might explain where things really go when they disappear. The caves remain sealed, legally off limits to everyone, but some things can't be locked out. Last winter, snowmelt uncovered a new crack in the hills above the lake, leading down into darkness. Rangers cemented it shut within a week. No one seemed sure how it formed, but the crew who did the work said they heard something moving down there before they poured. It didn't sound like rocks falling, they said. It sounded like scraping. Dr. Elaine Morris's paper wasn't the kind of thing most academics took seriously. It had a long title, something about ritual sites, sacrifice patterns, and ancient ecologies. You could tell just by the way it was written that she was frustrated when she finished it. The tone didn't feel academic at all, really. Instead of grounding itself in existing theories, it opened with a question. What if some places aren't meant to forget? That was her whole argument boiled down. There are places on Earth that retain memory, not just through fossils or ruins, but in the spaces themselves. And she believed Lake Tahoe was one of them. She submitted the paper to 6 journals. 5 flat out rejected it. The 6th returned it with comments like theoretical leaps, source issues, and insufficient field data. The problem wasn't the argument itself, not entirely. It was the leap she tried to make between science and storytelling. Her data relied partially on archaeological studies, but also on Washoe oral traditions, which mainstream academics tended to avoid, unless they were framed in purely cultural terms. Dr. Morris didn't do that. She treated the stories about water spirits and deep places that walk as direct evidence, stacking them up next to sonar charts and sediment surveys. Most academics didn't take kindly to that kind of approach. She found funding elsewhere. A small private foundation in Denver offered her enough money to assemble a team. They didn't care about her academic reputation. This was the kind of group that supported research into Bigfoot sightings or studied electromagnetic anomalies near haunted sites. She used the money to hire divers, rent equipment, and, most importantly, to get permits for limited water access. They focused on the lake's deepest trench, the place where, according to her theory, everything strange at Tahoe seemed to point. She didn't come up with the theory randomly. A lot of it was based on patterns she claimed to have found in burial sites near the shoreline. Prehistoric remains unearthed in that area are rare because the geology doesn't preserve much, but Morris pointed out that nearly all of the significant finds shared weird similarities. Remains were often surrounded by spirals or rings of stone, similar to the carvings found in the shallows where Sarah disappeared. One site, excavated in the 1980s, contained a cluster of bones laid out in perfect geometric forms. At the time, archaeologists figured this was ceremonial, maybe symbolic, but no one had followed up. Morris suggested that these weren't decorative arrangements. She believed they were functional, a way to pacify something she never quite named in her paper, but referred to vaguely as a presence tied to cycles of abundance and need. It wasn't even the geology of the trenches themselves that led her to this conclusion. It was their placement relative to everything else. The trench was surrounded by spots where lights had been reported, where currents didn't behave as currents should, and where strange gaps in the biodiversity of the lake were recorded. She linked these abnormalities to similar trouble spots at other infamous lakes, places with their own share of strange stories and tragedies. Crater Lake, for example. Some of its deepest regions remain unmapped, and it holds legends almost identical to Lake Tahoe's. She also mentioned Loch Ness, with its extremely local areas of excessive magnetic energy. Mainstream archaeologists rolled their eyes when they saw her trying to connect dots between curses, rituals, and perfectly natural geological events. But the private funders doubled down. They called her comparisons brave and groundbreaking. One even wrote a public blog calling out academia for ignoring outlier evidence. Morris ran with that support and planned her next major step, a new underwater expedition. Her team went out for 2 months during the summer of 2021, though you won't find any official reports from it. They didn't publish findings, only cryptic updates hinting at unexpected results and pressure hazards encountered while diving. What little information surfaced after came from a diver who quit halfway through. He told me they found something cavern-like near the lake bed during one of their deeper searches. It wasn't on any sonar charts, and when they probed it, the opening seemed to lead much farther down than they were equipped to handle. He wouldn't say what convinced him to leave the project, only that things got weird and the equipment kept malfunctioning. The backlash against Morris started after that summer. Her university placed her project on indefinite suspension, citing safety violations during the expedition. Then they revoked her credentials entirely after a review of professional conduct, which many saw as an excuse. She started crowdfunding to support her research, defiant in interviews. In one, she said, "The truth isn't something you can gatekeep. Even if you call it folklore, even if you claim it's irrelevant, you can't outrun it. Tahoe knows what it is. I'm just trying to figure out if we can live with it." Her final expedition is planned for next summer. Most contractors won't work with her anymore, so she's been building a team of outsiders, people with no reputations to lose. No permits have been filed yet for extended access, but locals have reported seeing her boat out on the lake during odd hours, usually before sunrise. At least one fisherman claims to have seen her pulling equipment from the same spot, where divers previously reported caverns. If she succeeds in returning to those areas, she promises to get answers this time. Whether she'll get to talk about them after remains the real question. Sarah Lang's case file still sits in the Tahoe Sheriff's Office, marked inactive pending new evidence. The official stance is that she likely drowned, though no body was recovered. But tourists and locals keep seeing things that don't fit that explanation. At least 12 people reported spotting a young woman matching Sarah's description, standing near the water at dusk last summer alone. The accounts all share eerie similarities. She's always facing the lake, never moves toward observers, and disappears when approached. Business owners around Tahoe avoid talking about these sightings. One hotel manager told me they train staff to change the subject if guests bring up the girl by the water. Restaurant menus highlight lake activities, but omit sunset views from certain tables, where multiple patrons claim to have seen the figure. A souvenir shop owner admitted pulling postcards showing the exact stretch of shore where Sarah vanished because tourists kept asking about it. Park rangers quietly increase patrols along the shoreline after dark. Their logs show they're particularly vigilant around full moons and summer solstices, though the schedule doesn't say why. One ranger's report describes encountering a possible trespasser near Cave Rock, who vanished before he could get close. The thermal camera footage shows a heat signature suddenly dropping from 98 degrees Fahrenheit to ambient temperature in under 3 seconds. The ranger requested reassignment to mountain trails the next day. Eyewitness accounts keep coming in despite the official silence. A couple from Phoenix videotaped what they thought was Sarah's ghost last August. The footage shows a pale figure in the distance, but forensic analysis revealed something strange. The image only appears in every third frame, like it's flickering in and out of existence. A family visiting from Colorado reported their daughter speaking to the sad lady by the big rocks for 10 minutes before they realized nobody was there. The girl insisted the woman told her about the rooms under the water. Law enforcement maintains these are all coincidences. The current sheriff told the press that Tahoe's unique lighting conditions played tricks on visitors' eyes. When asked about the thermal camera anomalies, he blamed faulty equipment. The department's psychologist suggests grief and suggestion combine to make people see what they expect to see near traumatic locations. But Sarah's parents don't buy that. They still get calls from strangers who swear they've seen their daughter, always describing the same details: faded jeans, a blue jacket, and hair blowing in wind that isn't there. People who try approaching the figure describe weird physical reactions. A college student said his skin prickled like static electricity when he got within 20 feet last June. His friend's camera drained from full charge to dead instantly. Another witness claimed the air went unnaturally still around the figure, muting all sound. A bartender who saw it while closing up told me his dog refused to go near that stretch of beach afterward, whining and pulling its leash whenever they passed by. The most disturbing account came from a retired Navy SEAL who trains search dogs. He was hiking near the shore when he spotted the figure and approached professionally, keeping his distance while observing. His notes describe the silhouette having wrong proportions, arms slightly too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. When he blinked, it vanished. but his GPS watch later showed he'd walked in a perfect circle around one spot for 15 minutes without realizing it. The device also recorded a temperature drop of 18 degrees during that time, with no weather conditions to explain it. Scientific explanations don't satisfy everyone. A team from Stanford set up night vision cameras along the shoreline last year, hoping to document wildlife. They caught several clear shots of deer and raccoons, but also one inexplicable frame showing a human-shaped blur mid-frame that their imaging software couldn't process. The lead researcher called it a lens artifact in his report, but kept the original file for personal study. Divers still avoid the lake's deepest trenches. The official reason cites dangerous currents, but experienced locals know better. A fisherman told me his depth finder once displayed error over the abyss near Rubicon Point, while everywhere else read normally. Another boater swore his anchor got stuck on something that pulled back briefly before releasing. Sonar scans from a 2021 geological survey show anomalies in that area. Large, moving shapes at depths where no fish should survive. The scientists labeled them sediment clouds in the final report. Sarah's parents visit Tahoe every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. They don't go to the popular memorial spots anymore, just stand quietly where the rangers found the marked stones. Last time, her mother left a single white rose at the water's edge. When they returned the next morning, the flower was gone, but the stem remained perfectly dry, resting atop one of the carved rocks. Nobody can explain how it got there without touching the water. The lake keeps its secrets. Tour boats still circle the deep parts, guides pointing out normal sights while avoiding certain areas. Kayak rentals come with unspoken rules about where not to paddle after dark. And every so often, someone snaps a photo of a lonely figure by the shore that disappears before they can get closer. The sheriff's department stopped taking reports about these sightings years ago. Their case file on Sarah now has just 3 words under current status: inactive, but unresolved. Meanwhile, the deepest part of Lake Tahoe remains untouched by divers, its bottom undisturbed by cameras or probes. The last attempt to explore it was a privately funded submersible project in 2019 that got cancelled after the pilot refused to go below 800 feet, citing equipment malfunctions. His logbook from that day, obtained through a public records request, contains one underlined sentence: "Something down there knows we're looking." The next scheduled dive never happened. The equipment was sold and the team disbanded. Now, when researchers request permits to study the lake's depths, they get form letters about environmental preservation concerns. Visitors still come to Tahoe for the scenery. The hotels remain full, the beach is busy. But locals notice small changes. More security cameras facing the water, fewer nighttime boat tours, kayak guides who suddenly change routes when shadows grow long. And on quiet evenings, when the sun dips behind the mountains, park rangers walk certain stretches of shoreline just a little faster than necessary, their flashlights sweeping the water's edge where the sand meets the dark. Royce Wilkins' lawyer arranged the interview as a last-ditch effort for leverage. After months behind bars, Wilkins hadn't said a word about Sarah Lang or Lake Tahoe. He flat out denied being involved, even as detectives laid his movements out point by point. His lawyer thought if Wilkins gave something, even a sliver of information, it might be enough to negotiate a reduced sentence for the crimes they could actually prove. What no one expected was how much Wilkins would talk, or the direction it would take. The interview happened in a small, windowless room inside the Montana prison, where Wilkins was serving 15 years for attempted abduction. They set a handheld recorder on the table, already running before Wilkins shuffled in, handcuffed to a guard on each side. His lawyer told him to just stick to the facts, answer what he was comfortable with, and emphasize his innocence when it came to Sarah. But once the question started, Wilkins seemed less interested in clearing his name and more invested in telling his own story. When I left Tahoe, Wilkins began, leaning back until the chair creaked under him. It wasn't because of her. I didn't even know she was missing until days later. But I'll tell you this, something else took her, not me, and not any man. The lead detective leaned in. What do you mean, something else? Wilkins thought for a moment, eyes drifting toward the wall like he was deciding just how much to say. Finally, he said, "You ever hear about those lights in the water? How they show up in the same places people go missing? I saw those lights the night before she disappeared. Bright ones, faint ones, different sizes, all moving together like they were alive. That's when I knew. Told myself, tomorrow's going to be bad." And yeah, it was. At first, the detectives assumed he was just pulling stories from local folklore, something easy to repeat from news clippings. But then Wilkins mentioned details they'd never released. Sarah's shoes, the stone circle divers found, even the brief footage showing her mouth moving just before she vanished. He didn't need prompting. It was like he already knew. You'd think the currents took her. Wilkins smirked at that, shaking his head. But the lake doesn't work like that. It's not the currents, and it's not the bottom. It's deeper than that, darker than that. The incredulous silence in the room made him laugh. He leaned forward, resting his cuffed hands on the metal table. You think I'm spinning tales. You think I'm a liar. But I'm telling you, I've been places, seen things out there that don't add up. Lake Champlain, Crater Lake, same stories, same missing folks, same damn lights. Tahoe just hides it better. One of the detectives finally broke in. You're saying you saw something in the water? He didn't phrase it as a question, but Wilkins nodded anyway. It's not in the water, he said, voice dropping to a near whisper. It is the water, the way it moves, the things it can do. Some places, the lake's not natural anymore. Upset the balance, throw off whatever rituals they used to do to keep it in check. He trailed off for a second, then added, almost as an afterthought, they don't realize they've stopped feeding it right. That's why it takes. The detectives asked if he was making a confession. A certain kind of confession, Wilkins replied. His tone made the room colder. A psychologist later reviewed his statements and noted his tendency to mix fact with cryptic phrasing, which she called a sign of pathological manipulation. But what threw her off was how calm he was. Not the usual defensive rambling she saw in serial offenders. It was like Wilkins believed every word. He speaks more like a witness than a perpetrator, she wrote in her assessment. But the most chilling moment came right before the interview ended. One of the officers, half as a final jab, asked him what he thought lived in the lake. Wilkins smiled, not in a way anyone found reassuring, and said, "You don't want the real answer, and even if I could tell you, you wouldn't believe me. Just don't ever look for her at night. That's their time. Let them keep it." He refused to say more after that. His lawyer tried to steer the conversation toward other cases, but Wilkins shut down completely. It was as though he'd finished with whatever he needed to say. The authorities, predictably, dismissed it all. Through official channels, they wrote off his comments as the ramblings of a disturbed, manipulative man, trying to deflect blame. Psych reports cited stress-induced paranoia from a life lived on the fringes, constantly moving from one place to another. The claims about lights in the water, ancient rituals, and something taking Sarah never made it into the case files. The detectives didn't want to risk giving his story more credibility than they felt it deserved. But that recording still exists. It sits in a locked cabinet somewhere, boxed up with other oddities from Tahoe cases that have long since gone cold. A retired deputy said the tape sometimes gets pulled out for training, like a reminder of how far people will go to avoid facing their mistakes. But there's another story from those who've listened to it. Supposedly, the tape ends with a faint sound in the background no one noticed during the interview. If you play it loud enough, beneath the chair creaks and cleared throats, you can hear something. Faint, rhythmic, like waves. Except it's not audio noise. It's like the recorder picked up something deeper in the room, something breathing, something waiting. Sarah's parents visit Lake Tahoe every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. They drive in silence for most of the trip, passing familiar landmarks that feel heavier with each visit. Her mother brings the same sweater, one of Sarah's favorites, folded neatly in her lap like a fragile talisman. Her father makes the same stops, coffee in Truckee, a quick pause near the overlook, where they used to picnic as a family. Neither of them say much while they're there, but you can tell it's not because they've moved on. They haven't. They've just stopped asking for answers. It wasn't always like this. The first few years they wanted action, answers. They paid for a private investigator who spent months combing through witness statements, chasing false claims, and retracing Sarah's last known steps. When he came back with things they couldn't discuss, hints at patterns the authorities ignored, strange details the official reports left out, they didn't know how to react. He told them not to go public. His voice was careful when he said it, like he wasn't just worried about evidence getting dismissed, but something worse, something he didn't want on his conscience. These days, Sarah's mother spends most of her nights awake, sitting by the window when storms roll in. About 2 years ago, during one of those long, sleepless nights, she swore she heard Sarah's voice. It wasn't clear, just faint enough to pull her into the rain without an umbrella. She stood there calling out, convinced Sarah was behind the storm, somewhere in the layers of wind and crashing water. She said the sound came from all directions, almost melodic, cutting through the rain like it wasn't meant for anyone else to notice. Her father didn't hear it, but that wasn't the end of it. Sarah's mother recorded the storm that night, just holding her phone up against the hum of rain on asphalt. When she played it back the next morning, there was something unexpected, static layered beneath the noise, faint but constant. She sent it to an audio expert, someone she'd found through grief counseling. He said it sounded almost like a voice, a pitch rising and falling oddly, but couldn't isolate anything distinct enough to say for sure. Could be interference, the email read. He tried offering her closure with technical language, but the audio file remains on her phone, replayed on the quiet nights when the weight of the house grows unbearable. The counseling she attended for a time helped her express the grief out loud, even when answers seemed impossible. Unresolved loss, they called it, though no label felt right. There is no proper name for what happens when you lose someone to a place. Her counselor talked about the weight of uncertainty, how it collapses into silence between family members like a wall that never fully comes down. Sarah's mother said that wall got taller after the first few anniversaries, when they stopped expecting anything new and started focusing on just holding their pain in place, keeping it from spilling over the edges of their lives. Her father handles things differently, more quietly. Each year, when they visit the lake, he keeps a ritual of his own. He stays a little longer after his wife walks back to the car, lingering by the same rock where Sarah's shoes were placed that night. One of the rocks in her last known footprint. No one knows exactly what he does there, but her mother says she watches him from the passenger window. She's sure he talks to Sarah, barely moving his mouth, just standing there with his back to the water. Then, right before he leaves, he bends down and touches the surface with his fingers. Always the same spot, barely disturbing the stillness. When the scholarship fund was announced in Sarah's name, they held a simple ceremony at her old high school. Her mother didn't make a speech. She just handed out pamphlets thanking donors and shook hands with the principal. Her father stayed by the side door, watching through a small window. He wanted to keep it low-key, they said, because anything else would have felt like one of those memorial services designed to give closure. None of this gave them closure. That wasn't the point. The scholarship supports local students pursuing environmental studies, a field Sarah had shown interest in during her final year. It's the only public gesture her parents have made about her disappearance in years. Most of their memorials have become quiet things, unspoken traditions, private agreements not to let go and not to try too hard to explain. There is still one room in their house they've left untouched. Sarah's mother calls it her daughter's place in time. Everything positioned exactly where Sarah liked it. Books on her desk, a scarf draped on the back of her chair. Dusting it feels like an act of care, not mourning, but they don't admit how often either of them stand in that doorway, just staring at how the light falls through the window onto the empty bed. It started as a normal summer evening. Lily, a local teenager, was hanging out with 3 of her friends at a small, rocky beach on Tahoe's quieter North Shore. They had a speaker, some snacks, and phones out flashing with the kind of photos and selfies that didn't feel out of place near the water at sunset. The group wasn't supposed to be at the lake that late. Most people around town know better than to stick around after dark. But Lily's friends weren't exactly the rule-following type. And besides, they figured they weren't far from the main road. What's the worst that could happen? Lily wandered closer to the shallows, her sandals pressing into the soft gravel as the sun dipped lower. The way she tells it now, she was just stepping down to skim rocks across the water when she caught movement in the corner of her eye. A figure. The person stood partly in the water, just past where the lake bed dropped deeper, hair loose and pale in the dusk light. Lily froze, unsure if she was seeing things or if someone else had stepped into the water from another hidden path. Still, nothing about the figure's posture, not the sharpness of its outline against the lake, nor the stillness of its reflection in the rippled water, looked casual. Then it moved, a slow tilt of the head as if noticing Lily for the first time. A small gesture. Or maybe, as Lily later described, it looked more like an invitation. A beckoning. She screamed. Not a loud, dramatic scream, she said, but one that spilled out instinctively, soft and high-pitched, like something pushing out of her throat before she could stop it. Her friends on the beach turned to look in her direction, startled, but Lily darted back before any of them could process what was wrong. Frantic and yelling by the time they reached her, Lily pointed toward the water, insisting through heaving breaths that she'd seen someone, that they were standing right there just seconds ago. Her friends stepped cautiously to the edge, peering into the water. All they saw were faint ripples spreading from the deeper parts of the lake like something had just left. Probably just a swimmer, her friend Jason said. Or maybe your reflection freaked you out. You're too close to the edge." The others laughed, brushing it off, but Lily swore it wasn't a mistake. "It wasn't me," she told them. "It was someone else. They looked at me." The group decided to listen to Lily's gut and drove back into town earlier than planned. Whatever mood lingered from their night was heavier now, each of them falling quiet in the car as Lily's breathing finally slowed. The story might have ended there, just nerves, an eeriness you could explain away later if it weren't for the footage. A few days later, after Lily couldn't stop bringing it up, Jason pulled up security footage from his cabin's outdoor cameras. One overlooked the beach where they'd been that night. He meant to prove they hadn't seen anyone, maybe even catch Lily's shadow or reflection to settle her nerves. Instead, what they found made even him go pale. The camera, high quality and motion triggered, captured Lily stepping toward the water. The timestamp read 8:36 p.m., just before sunset. You can see her hesitating, looking toward the shoreline, the faint movement of her body as she suddenly stumbles back. And in certain frames, not all of them, but certain ones, you can see what she's looking at. Her figure appears right on the edge of the water, just far enough to stay out of the clearer spotlight. It flickers on the footage, frame by frame, like half of it exists, and the other half doesn't. Jason took it to a friend who'd studied digital forensics. His friend ran the footage through software designed to detect fabric textures, infrared anomalies, and tampering signatures. There was no distortion, no sign of manipulation. All the other objects on the camera, the rocks, the reeds, even the bugs caught flitting through the frame, moved as they should. The flickering, he said, wasn't caused by the camera. "It's almost like the figure doesn't fully belong in the light," he told Jason, "like it can only exist on the edges of how we see." What truly stood out, though, was one small detail. In the clearer frames, you can spot the figure's hand raised slightly by its side. It's holding something long and dark, a thin stick or maybe a braid of weeds wound tightly. The forensic tech couldn't make it clearer, and when they zoomed in too far, the image blurred, like the camera refused to process it. After that, Lily wouldn't leave her house, let alone go back to the lake. Her mother confirmed they moved a month later. She wouldn't sleep, her mum said, listing how she kept nightlights on, refused to close the shades, and started crying whenever anyone suggested she'd imagined the whole thing. I told her she was safe, but she'd just say, "Not if it saw me run." When I asked where they're living now, her mother just said, "Someplace farther from water." Lake Tahoe keeps its secrets. Whether it's human evil or something older, some questions remain unanswered for a reason. The official reports say accidents or drownings, but locals know better. They've seen the way dogs refuse certain shorelines, how cameras glitch near deep water. The marked stones still appear sometimes, though nobody knows who puts them there. Sarah's parents visit every year, throwing handfuls of dirt into the water like some ritual they don't explain. Rangers patrol more now, especially at dusk. The lake looks calm today, sparkling under the sun. But everyone here knows better than to go in after dark. Some doors should stay closed.